All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming. We're so glad you're here to our webinar about learning from the media, a conversation with journalists. We have three wonderful panelists that we'll be hearing from in just a minute. I will not take long, but we do have to do the requisite, here's who's doing the webinar piece. So from the Fire Networks who are putting on this webinar, I want to welcome you. My name is Laurel Kays. I work for the Nature Conservancy's North America Fire Unit, as does James Miller, who's going to be moderating the panel today. And that unit is part of this Fire Networks partnership, which is made up of the Fire Learning Network, the program that I personally manage, the TREX Prescribed Fire Training Exchange, the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and the Indigenous Peoples Learning Network. And all of us who coordinate those programs across multiple organizations all work together to coordinate that portfolio, which also includes the Women in Prescribed Fire Training Exchange WTREX program, which is currently running a training at the Niobrara Valley Preserve in Nebraska, which is super exciting. You can follow that on Facebook. They've already posted some really fun pictures. Just briefly show a map of where we work. We're all across the US. If it's something that you're interested in learning more about, either the overall partnership or one of those individual programs, we do have a website. You can visit firenetworks.org. Feel free to head there. At the end of this webinar, James and I's contact information will be up. If you have any questions, more than free to reach out to us. One quick logistics slide. As some of you have noticed, this is the Zoom webinar platform. So you are muted and off camera unless you are one of our panelists. For interacting with panelists and hosts, for the chat feature, please use that for things like technical difficulties. For panelist questions that you would like James to pose to the panelists, please use that Q&A feature. I'll try and monitor the chat, and if people forget, ask them to throw that in the Q&A because that's where James is going to be looking, but please do try and throw your questions there. That also lets you use the upvote feature that's in the question and answer box. So if someone asks a question you also want to be asked, you can click the little thumbs up next to it. And we'll try and prioritize questions that multiple people are interested in that have a couple upvotes. So please do use that and let us know the things you want to make sure we have time to get to today. Also add that this webinar is going to be recorded, is being recorded. We will send that recording out to everyone who is registered when it is available, and that will be hosted on the Fire Learning Network YouTube channel for everyone to watch once that's ready. And with that, James, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce the panelists and get rolling.
Awesome. Thank you, Laurel. And yeah, just want to reiterate our gratitude to the panelists today. And it's really exciting to have an opportunity to learn from you and also to everybody who's joining. Welcome. So I'm James Miller. My title is Associate Communications Director for the Nature Conservancy's North America Fire Program. I spent about a decade in daily newspaper journalism as a reporter before moving over to environmental nonprofit communications about 15 years ago. In 2022, when I took my current role helping lead communications for the North America Fire Program and the Fire Networks, I thought I knew something about wildland fire and the communities around it. Today, I know that I know a little bit more, and I have a ton more to learn. And I was thinking about this webinar. It occurred to me that I could have said the same thing about journalism and the business of journalism, and I probably still could say that. And I think something these fields have in common is that they're high profile, in public view, but they're often not well understood by folks who aren't directly involved with them. And I think today we have a really incredible panel who can help connect the dots between these fields. And I think the level of interest in the conversation is underscored by really the great participation we have in the webinar. So I just reiterate, please put your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. There is an upvote option, which will help us prioritize. We'll start with a few questions we've already established based on information that you sent in beforehand, as well as conversations with the panelists. So Today, we have three panelists who have significant and significantly diverse experience covering as journalists wildfire, proactive beneficial fire, and the people closest to both. April Ehrlich is a reporter at Oregon Public Broadcasting. She covers lands and environmental policies in Oregon and Southwest Washington. Maura O'Connor is a freelance journalist and the author of the book Ignition: Lighting Fires in a Burning World. Her work has appeared online in the Atavist, Slate, the New Yorker, Nautilus, Harper's, and more. Roberto Rosales is a photojournalist who has covered wildfire in much of the West, and he is also a photography professor at the University of New Mexico. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you again. And as just a kind of a thumbnail introduction, April, would you like to kick us off by telling us a little bit more about yourself, your experience with journalism, and your experience with fire?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a journalist in Oregon since about 2014. I started my career in very far eastern Oregon on the Oregon-Idaho border, where I worked for a couple of years. And as you can imagine, the landscape out there is very different than what a lot of people imagine when they think of Oregon. It's a desert, lots of sagebrush, juniper trees, and the fires out there are just a very different animal to deal with. I moved to Southern Oregon, was a newspaper reporter there, eventually made my way into public radio down in Ashland, working for Jefferson Public Radio. And that's where I started really covering wildfires, mostly in Northern California, because our public radio station covered both Northern California and Southern Oregon. So I covered a lot of the fires down in Northern California specifically. There's the Klamathon fire, just smaller ones that had some impacts on people. But the biggest one was the Carr fire in Redding, California, that destroyed about 1,000 homes. And during that time, I dug into the experiences that people had with the fire management, emergency management teams there. So I did a whole series about people's experiences evacuating from the fire, depending on, it was mostly about how fires impact marginalized communities. So people who were homeless, people who were Latino, people who had disabilities, just like folks with different experiences who weren't really in mind when we developed these emergency management systems. So there were some shortcomings that they experienced. And that series I did ended up winning a couple of awards. I was really proud of that work. Fast forward to 2020, then the Alameda fire, the Labor Day fires hit Oregon. I was living in Talent, Oregon at the time, which was one of the towns that lost several hundred homes. In fact, everything directly across the street from me was destroyed. So that was when I got to experience what it was like to evacuate and be impacted by fire. And that was a really strange experience, to see this big plume of smoke and oh, I'm here. I am here on the time of the fire. I can go do reporting on it. But I also need to evacuate my family right now. So I was kind of torn between my personal and professional life at that point. So I have done a lot of reporting on that fire since then, looking mostly into emergency management and emergency disaster recovery. There were, again, a lot of shortcomings. There weren't any emergency alerts for people in Talent, even though half our town was destroyed. And a lot of people were lacking in getting disaster recovery, particularly immigrant communities. We had a lot of farm worker communities in Talent and Phoenix, Oregon, and they just faced a lot of challenges when it came to getting relief. So that's about my experience. I ended up leaving in 2021 and moving to Portland, Oregon. And now I am the Lands and Environmental Policies reporter. I haven't done a whole lot of wildfire coverage since the Alameda fire. I had to take a little bit of a break. It was a heavy one, but I'm going to be jumping back on it. And there are a lot of issues that we're looking at here in Oregon, specifically with putting together the wildfire risk map, looking into insurance issues, et cetera. I guess finally, I'll just say one more thing. I'm part of a group of folks who helped implement a bill that allows journalists to get access to wildfire zones. And I can probably talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, so I'm pretty involved in the world still, but specifically here in Oregon.
Thank you so much, April. Maura, would you like to jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, great. Happy to be here. I started out as a kind of daily news reporter in New York City for newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. So working a lot of criminal justice stories and kind of stomping the pavement, so to speak, before kind of turning my attention abroad and working in countries like Haiti and Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, covering humanitarian stories, agriculture, foreign aid, just a bunch of different stuff. And I'd say about 10 years ago, I kind of switched my emphasis to largely science reporting, with a real strong focus on kind of the ethics and politics around conservation issues, landscape management, technology. I kind of think of myself as an ideas journalist, so I really like to look at the ideas and sort of the history that animates current events and try to kind of take deep dives into them through like long form narrative journalism. So I don't really work on a daily news deadline. For the most part, I sort of take a pretty long time to report in depth for, magazines. And then also as an author, I've written several books. So I came to fire in a sort of very roundabout way, traveling in Australia and getting interested in Aboriginal burning practices because I had never seen intentional fires being lit on a landscape. And it really piqued my interest, and it got me trying to find out more about fire ecology, a subject that I didn't know anything about. And so that's what sort of brought me to wildfires and prescribed fires, was this interest in the science of fire and this understanding that, there are so many fire adapted landscapes to which fire is beneficial and necessary. And then looking at the media coverage of wildfires, particularly out west in the United States, and trying to understand the relationship between those two facts. On the one hand, fire is beneficial to landscapes, and on the other hand, wildfire is, can be disastrous. And so it was trying to connect those two things and make sense of them that led me to a 4-year kind of reporting project for my book Ignition. I think what was really interesting, and I want to put out there, is that access for me was immediately an issue. So as a journalist, I wanted to get close and speak to fire practitioners, people that I understood to be experts in this art and science of intentionally lit fires. And in order to do that, I sort of took perhaps unusual route of becoming NWCG qualified so that I could go onto fire lines and work with people. And so I think typically that would be like a sort of embedded model of journalism where you're embedding yourself amongst your sources and reporting that way. So yeah, and Trex's became a really important source of that reporting for me. So I just got back from a Trex in Nebraska a couple weeks ago. I think I'm what they call a Trexaholic now. And that was a very fruitful avenue for me to report on this issue and for my book and other magazine stories. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Roberto?
So I moved to New Mexico back in 2000. I was based in Washington, D.C., where I was a freelancer. In 2001, I became a staff photographer with the Albuquerque Journal, where I worked until last year when I was laid off due to budget constraints. But during my 23 years of photojournalism with the newspaper, I cover a numerous amount of wildfires, both in California and Arizona, and also here in New Mexico. But my experiences before photographing wildfires was really covering breaking news events, catastrophes, Hurricane Katrina, mass shootings, that kind of deal. And I think those events prepared me for what I encounter while covering wildfires in California in the early 2000s, which was out of control. The biggest challenge that I faced, along with my colleagues, was that we thought the same approach that we took in California or Arizona, for that matter, was going to work here in New Mexico. And quickly I realized it is a complicated process of getting the access that we got in California and in Arizona. New Mexico is very complex because we have native lands that dot the landscape and who are surrounded by forests, U.S. forests, and tribal forests, if you will. So we have not only tribal police, as well as sheriff's department and state police that we have to go around. And for the most part, photojournalists, or journalists for that matter, do not have any access to wildland fires here in New Mexico, unless you happen to get there before road closures, of course. But having said that, I think there are some journalists here in New Mexico who are efforting to get a bill passed to try to get access, just like we would in California. And I know there were a few working through the Society for Professional Journalists, the Rio Grande chapter, that are going forward and trying to introduce a bill so that we have that same access. Everywhere I've been to photograph a wildland fire here in New Mexico, I get the same response from the public, is why can't you tell us what's going on? And most people believe that just because we're journalists, we're going to walk into a fire and describe what's going on, and that's not the case. So it can be very frustrating when we're also blamed for not giving enough coverage, and we're trying all we can. And so today, I work part-time. I wear many hats. I work part-time for an online newspaper that we just started here in Albuquerque, City Desk ABQ, where we cover daily issues. So I'm wearing that hat, and I'm also working independently for AP, Zuma Press, and any other agencies that call out for covering wildfires, which right now is the season's about to start. And again, a lot of people from the outside rely on photographers like myself to get these images out, because if you're based in Albuquerque like I am, I mean, the biggest cities are so far away. This is a huge state. So trying to get out there, make meaningful images, and yet find a Wi-Fi spot or cell phone range to send images back to agencies, that can create a problem too. So there's a lot of issues that as a photojournalist you encounter here in New Mexico, but things are getting better, except the access, which is like the critical point that we need to tackle. And hopefully that gets turned around sometime in the near future.
Thank you, Roberto, and Beth. Thanks all. So much to think about there. So I think a lot of the folks in our audience today are involved in, I mean, obviously there's wildfire, but there's also a lot of work to try to engage with the media around proactive beneficial fire. And I'm curious, you know, is kind of stepping back and going to that, you know, from a journalist perspective, what kind of stories engage you? You know, I think responding to emergencies, you know, is one thing, but what other stories attract you in this space? And you know, we had some questions about kind of the best ways to reach out to journalists, the best ways to, you know, share stories. Anyone want to take a shot at that one?
I think going back after a fire has started, you know, to sort of maintain a connection with some victims and seeing how the trajectory of what happened during and after, that is a process that is not dealt with a lot in journalism in general. And I think in this area, where we lack a lot of journalists in general, because we're a poor state, you know, it doesn't pay well. So New Mexico has become a pit stop for a lot of journalists in training, and they move on. So there's only a few that can stay here and remain in the area that can continue that process to have that connection with the community that was mainly affected by wildfires. So keeping that tradition of checking in and seeing where that trajectory leads, that's very important.
Yeah, I would say most of my colleagues and I are very interested in getting out on prescribed burns and covering that, how they are beneficial for the forest, et cetera. The biggest challenge we face with covering that, though, is going out to them. They often happen last minute. They require us to have Nomex, which is very expensive, and other gear. They happen, I don't know if I already said this, they happen last minute. So we have trouble just like maneuvering our schedules for that or planning for it, especially if we have a videographer that we have to schedule in advance or a photographer that we have to bring along. So I would say just developing relationships with journalists and finding what would work for them and their needs, so that they can get out and be part of the story. Because a lot of journalists, I don't think, really thrive on doing stories based off of press releases. They will do them to feed the beast, but they want to get out there. They want to get sound. They want to get photos. They want to get quotes. They want to build a good story. And the only way to do that is to get out into the field. So any way that you can provide those opportunities to journalists, I think, is the best way to get that narrative out there.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of those points completely. And I would add to them that in my experience, and my experience just as a reader and a consumer of news and news stories, like one of the absolutely essential elements and what a journalist kind of, I think, needs and can craft a story out of is really people. And so individuals, communities, characters, not just like expert sources, but like people who are on the ground, who are doing something unusual or, you know, fascinating or interesting or challenging, people, and being able to like directly quote people is really almost everything. You know, even as a science journalist, there could be like a science topic that is quite worthy of a story, but the only way to really make that come alive, for in my experience, is to really be having characters that are going to animate and make a story feel propulsive and engaging. And in my experience, readers, that's what they respond to as well, is a story about people. So yeah, being able to have those conversations. And it's interesting because I think it's a lot of the practitioners on the ground, like who are in this audience today, who know who those people are, or maybe the participants in this webinar today are those characters that journalists need, you know, to be able to talk to someone who has 30 years experience, someone who's, you know, from a community. So yeah, I think, you know, that's hugely important in my experience.
Is there a way to you know, recognizing, you know, April, as you noted, the sort of with prescribed fire in particular, the planning, the scheduling, you know, it can be really tricky because you don't know until the last minute whether it's going to happen. And um, are there, beyond being, you know, when that becomes an issue, are there still ways for people like the folks that are in the audience today to help you get to stories and help you get sources and help you get where you need to be without being on site, say it's something that you can't get access to?
I mean, yeah, there are always like for me, it might be helpful to have audio or video or photos. The problem with that is you really have to have a good understanding of what it is I need or what it is I would like to do with the story. And generally, I don't trust people to produce the quality because they're not journalists. And they're not doing the type of work I'm doing. So it's really difficult for that to work. For instance, this is not fire related, but there was a story recently about wolves being translocated from Oregon to Colorado. And they said they were going to give me video. I was like, great. They gave me the video. It was overlaid with like music, right? And like, I need real sounds. I don't need music. I'm a radio reporter, right? So yeah, I think it's doable, but it would require a lot of communication between whoever's going to be gathering that material and the reporter who is going to be using it. I don't think that it's something that you could do for all reporters at once if you're just shooting out materials to everybody, because everybody's unique and they have different needs.
I could step into maybe with a couple thoughts here, because in my experience, you know, being on prescribed burns, I wear two hats, so to speak, often where I'm like on a prescribed burn, looking at it from the perspective of a journalist and what's taking place that would be included and make for a good narrative as part of a story. And then on the other hand, I'm working and part of the operation. It's actually, being there is sometimes not great as a journalist because things are happening so quickly. So I actually think that being on a prescribed burn when the burn is happening is great, especially from like an audio and visual perspective. But for a storytelling perspective, it's actually not as critical as even I once thought. And there's a lot of benefit, I think, from being able to take a journalist out to a unit that is about to be burned or being prepped to explain the history behind like why this burn is going to be important, what ecological or social goals it's going to serve, like why hasn't this piece of land burned before, what's the background, and then even a post-fire walkabout with a journalist could be really critical too. And in my experience, that's where I can get a lot of like essential background information that I would need anyways, fantastic quotes. I can get a visual of what it looked like before or after. So I think there are other ways to look at, to cover a prescribed burn that maybe bypass some of the logistical hurdles and even safety concerns. One thing I wanted to put out there is I think it would be really cool if there was a venue for journalists to get safety training for fire, like reporting on fire. There's some things out there where journalists are taught sort of an ecological, like more like an academic setting where we get a lot of information on sort of wildfire science or et cetera. But a safety training program, there's programs in New York City, for instance, where journalists get safety training on reporting in combat zones. And so an equivalent for reporting on fire, whether it was a prescribed burn or not, would be an incredible opportunity that I know a lot of journalists would benefit from. And maybe it would solve some of the institutional liability questions that prevent organizations from bringing us out because they think it's too dangerous. So, yeah.
I know that while working for the newspaper, one of the issues we had, especially during the Hermit Peak Calf Canyon fire a couple of years ago, it was in a remote area just north of Albuquerque, but talking to some ranchers who were concerned that this was already getting out of control, and then us relying on them providing the imagery or maybe short videos. The folks that we were dealing with had no idea about deadlines. And so we would set up space on the front page or another section or online, but we never were able to get that reliable material. So it really put us in a bind a lot of the times. Another thing about safety and training, I know that the period for acquiring a red card, if you will, where you go through a 5-day training session where you learn about firefighting and so on, that period just ended in March. So, and it's only offered once a year, at least here in New Mexico. And I think to have this training periodically throughout the year would benefit journalists who can't make time or the space to go out and get certified, at least just to be aware of what can happen. Because I think too many people now, especially freelancers, approach fires without proper training, and they're gung-ho, and they put other firefighters or other personnel in danger because they're trying to get that image.
It came up earlier in conversation, Roberto, I think you mentioned it, that in New Mexico, for example, that there's a lot of people who in journalism who transition through the state, so there's a lot of turnover. And, I've certainly seen that, in both in my current role and as a reporter. And I think, that creates some challenges too, because some reporters, like the three of you, have spent a lot of time in this space and have built understanding. But, reporters who, for the first time, are being asked to cover a wildfire, cover a prescribed burn, are, at a really a disadvantage. And, I think I don't know. There's not really an answer for that, I guess, but, or is there?
I mean, that is a really good point, because throughout 23 years of working at the same newspaper, every 5 years or so, I would be assigned to cover a fire with a rookie, if you will, for lack of a better term. But that was a good process, because you don't want to have two newcomers to the area that have only worked in the East Coast, let's say, and do not understand fire behavior and the landscape and so on. So always trying to match someone with limited experience to someone who's been through it many times. That was always the goal for our newspaper to have. But to be able to infiltrate native or tribal lands without knowing cultural issues, and you've never set foot in New Mexico, where we are surrounded by tribal lands everywhere, that can be a shocking reality. So mixing novice and experience, that should always be the case, but I know it's not it.
I'd like to weigh in too, if that's okay. I just want to be clear that, like, it should be the journalist's responsibility to educate themselves to a point to be able to report safely and responsibly on any subject that they're working on. And so, a journalist that goes onto tribal land and has not prepared themselves adequately about, language and it's not that every journalist has endless amounts of time to do that, but I just want to be clear that journalists should be showing up prepared to these stories. And if they're not, that's really on them. But there is ways that journalists do that I want to point out. For instance, the Native American Journalists Association has journalism guides that list certain issues and questions that journalists can ask themselves when they're coming to a story. And likewise, I think it is incredibly useful if there were similar journalism guides for reporting on wildfires, reporting on the Forest Service, reporting on prescribed fire. The only one that I'm aware of, but it is quite good, it's I think a little bit dated, is put out by the organization FUSI in Oregon. And it's excellent because it's not meant to determine what questions journalists ask or what type of coverage they produce, but it puts forth some issues and ideas that can help orient a journalist in a direction that they might not be aware of if they're coming to the topic with little to no experience. And I think, you know, any nonprofit, any organization with a stake in this issue can put out a journalism guide that journalists can look at that can help them understand what questions could be asked and what's interesting. And it's a launching off point, I think, for better and more ethical reporting on these issues, guided by people who really know a lot about them.
Yeah, that's, you know, that kind of segues to a couple of questions that we had looked at, and, you know, one was about resources, you know, and I know University of Oregon School of Journalism and the Oregon State Extension published the Stories of Fire: Resources for Media Covering Wildfire Events and Topics in Oregon. Are, you know, I guess a couple of questions. One, and I think, Maura, you just indicated that resources like this are valuable to journalists. Are there resources that might be similarly valuable that you're aware of for people who are trying to engage with journalists? Or I guess maybe another way to put it is, you know, for the folks on this call, how, you know, a webinar like this is meant to help with this, but how can they learn how to work with journalists?
I love the idea of putting together something for like PIOs. Without understanding all of their needs and questions, you know, based on whatever agency or nonprofit they work with, it would be difficult to do a general one that would work for everybody. But I would say, not knowing of any that exist right now, the best method is to just build relationships with people. Just introduce yourself, say, hey, can we get on a phone call real quick? I'd love to hear about what you do, and I can tell you what I do, and just learn that way. That might be hard for folks who are covering national issues, because I imagine that's a lot of people to have to connect with. But for me as a local reporter, like my go-to agencies, Oregon, you know, ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry, and I have relationships with those PIOs. I have their cell phone numbers, and we know each other, and that is really beneficial for being able to communicate what we need and being able to get the stories out there that we want to tell.
I think it would be crucial for PIOs to understand that the local media should also have the same access as national outlets. And that's one of the issues we always face. The New York Times is in town, they're going to get access to interviews before, you know, our local newspaper will, you know, get that interview. And we are more localized, and we can probably relate to what's going on and mention other resources that are more important to the local residents than the national audience. So that's also a big challenge that we face here in New Mexico. You know, we are just a local town newspaper, and we have to compete with Associated Press and New York Times and so on. So if we could all be on the same page, but I know PIOs, they're all different. They all have different backgrounds, so they can prioritize. But we need to be treated equal.
Yes, as a former journalist, I can, that resonates with me.
Thank you.
I would like to just weigh in and say that in my experience, the PIO system within the Forest Service, at least, is quite broken, and I find consistently that the PIO is a barrier to access rather than an entry point. And so it became clear to me early on in my reporting that my whole goal was to get around the PIO system. And so not that it isn't essential and important from a sort of institutional perspective to have someone there who can interact with the media and be that point person, but oftentimes as a journalist that can be quite frustrating because you're sort of, it's a barrier. My advice to people who don't necessarily have media training or don't have that formal title of like a PIO, that's not what they're doing day in and day out, is if you're interacting with a journalist at the start of a, who's interested in a story, to have a really frank conversation early on about how they work and be sure that they're explaining to you in the clearest terms what their reporting process is and what kind of fact checking they do, what the publication deadline is, so that you have just a very transparent understanding of how they work and what to expect, so that there aren't sort of these really unpleasant surprises that I often find when I'm coming to a story. I'm sort of like cleaning up these messes that journalists leave behind them sometimes when they didn't explain how they're going to quote somebody, or whether or not they're going to fact check and this kind of stuff. So I think just asking really simple, maybe seemingly dumb questions like, well, how do you work? Like, how does this work for you? And there is no one standard. So it's important, I think, on a case-by-case basis to understand who you're working with and what they're interested in and what that process is going to look like. There's, I think that's just really helpful from the start.
There's a question in the chat, and or in the Q&A, and I think we've kind of backed into addressing it, but I'll go ahead and share it and see if anyone wants to add anything more on that, and then I maybe have a follow-up on that last piece. But the question is, can you all speak to your experience working with public information professionals on incident management teams? Those of us who work on those teams would be interested to hear more about common frustrations, success stories, etc., to know how to do our jobs better. And again, maybe we've covered that, but I just want to see if anyone wants to add anything to that.
I would like to say that a lot of the times reporters don't know who they are. Like in Oregon, we have a very convoluted way of fighting fire, where there are multiple jurisdictions. It really depends on where the fire starts. Is it a U.S. Forest Service fire? Is it an ODF fire? Is it a county fire? So just even knowing who to call is a big issue. But like I said before, I'm pretty close with the PIOs, with the state firefighting department, and mostly because of my work on the bill giving access to journalists in wildfire zones. They created a training. I worked with them on that training. And I think that was helpful, mostly because they have told me, if I'm not the person to call for this one fire, I will know who you should call, right? Like if ODF isn't it's a US Forest Service or BLM or whatever, I know who I can connect you with. So that was really beneficial to me. It's just like helping me figure out who I'm supposed to be talking to.
Maureen, you mentioned, I think, kind of editorial processes and reporting processes. And I think that's an interesting thing to dig into a little bit. In my opening comments, I was talking about kind of the mystery of journalism, the mystery of news gathering for a lot of the public. And, I guess the question might be like, for example, you gave great advice, which is ask what the process is going to be. I think there's a lot of times confusion around editorial processes and the degree to which people have the ability to influence editorial processes or revisit quotes or things like that. What kind of expectations should people have? You know,
I think, you know, one of the things that's frustrating for journalists and then also frustrates, I think, people who get interviewed for stories or something is that journalists often don't have a lot of control over the framing of their story and how it's ultimately presented in a newspaper or magazine or online. And so I think it's important for journalists to explain that and for sources to understand, like, I'm going to do my best to report truthfully and accurately and fact check everything you tell me. But in the end, my editor might choose a headline that we don't feel necessarily fully reflects, you know, the nuance or the most important even aspect of this story. They might choose something based on what they think readers are going to click on. And so that's a really, I think, key and unfortunate part of the journalism world. I think, yeah, so that's one of the key things that I think people should be aware of. I think I just wanted to go back maybe really quickly also to the PIO communications issue, because I think that one of the interesting things that has been lost in wildfire coverage going back to, you know, even 80 years ago, or, you know, is that the media tends to cover every wildfire as a natural disaster story. And I think what's frustrating now to sources that I've spoken to, you know, in the fire science world and the academic world, but also in the sort of nonprofit world, is like, that's not always the full picture. And so we want to try to expand the sort of understanding and the appetite on the public's, you know, part of what fire is, where it is critical, how it works, you know, all these other aspects. And so my frustration sometimes with the PIO, you know, model is that what gets put out there is often just a disaster story and sort of misses a lot of, I think, the potential other aspects that could be written about and spoken about. And so, like, I think the best example is just that how the Forest Service and these incident management teams are constantly putting out maps with fire perimeters, right? And from an evacuation standpoint, that can be important. But from a story about the effects of wildfire, which range, you know, as we know, from, you know, moderate to severe and beneficial to disastrous, like there's a spectrum, that red blob map is not helpful at all as a communication strategy for talking about all these other nuances of wildfire and stuff. So I just find it a very kind of one-dimensional, almost like a, you know, it's a blunt instrument for communicating to the public, and too often it sort of dictates how journalists and the news media often cover these events. So I just wanted to throw that out there too.
I think that's really interesting. There's a specific question related to PIOs that I want to share, and then I'd love to go back to that last thread. But the question, currently our dispatchers have a schedule and contact for the PIOs at Alabama Forestry Commission. We did this so media can have access. Is that a practical solution to the panelist? So a schedule and contact for PIOs at the Forestry Commission.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to know a little bit more about how that works, like what sort of access they're giving, how easy it is for, like, who are they giving access to, I would definitely need to know more information. But what I could do maybe is explain what we did here in Oregon and what exists in California. So up until recently, California was the only state that allowed reporters into road-blocked areas. There's basically like 2 sentences that says the media has access. So it's kind of the Wild West out there. Pros and cons to that, right? Like the pro is that we get all sorts of very captivating images out of wildfires in California. Journalists are always getting the good stories out there. The con is that it looks like we mostly only have fires in California because journalists have access to those areas. Another con is that a lot of journalists that aren't as trained as they should be or aren't as sensitive as they should be sometimes gain access to those areas, and there have been some issues with that. not to pick on TV news people, but it's always TV news people. And it just, yeah, really, really unfortunate when stuff like that happens, because it makes the rest of us look bad, and it makes it so other states don't want to give access to journalists. So what we did in Oregon was we recognized what was happening in California. We wanted to do something similar, but with some caveats. So we passed a bill that says journalists have access with these caveats. They need to take a 1-hour training every year. The training goes over safety. It also goes over some ecology stuff, just basic stuff. They also need to have proper PPE, depending on what the disaster is, because we're actually giving access to journalists in any natural disaster zones. So if it's like a flood or an earthquake, they need to have like general PPE, which is a high-vis vest, goggles, boots, pants, etc. If they're going into a roadblocked area where a fire has blown through, like a neighborhood, that's also general PPE, high-vis vest, goggles, mask, etc. If they're going into a wildland fire where there's an active fire burning, they need to have Nomex gear. They need to have boots with, 6 inches from the heel, etc. They need to have a fire shelter, and they need to know how to use the fire shelter. So those are all the things that we passed. And basically, the incident commander does have the ability to shut down access. That's kind of their call if it's something really intense, or maybe a journalist is breaking the rules, they can always deny access. But I think that this effort was really beneficial because it brought journalists to the table with firefighters, with police officers, with PIOs, incident managers, and we all just kind of put our issues out on the table and worked them out together. And I think we came away with a better relationship. We're only in year 2, so still working out some things, but I think that this has been really beneficial and probably something other people should be pursuing in their states.
Yeah, one of the issues we had with PIOs here in New Mexico was when we were granted access, escorted access into certain areas. Picture this, we were 10 different outlets who were going in. Half of them would be TV crews. The access was given to all of us. However, we were all grouped as one. They thought we had just one perspective in general, and TV wanted shots. They needed like the hardcore, clip for their 5 o'clock news, but that's not newsprint. We have a totally different perspective, and we wanted access to interviews. So they group us all together, and we are 10 different outlets that have the same perspective on one particular area. And everyone just showed frustration. Newsprint has different goals, and I think the PIOs need to understand that so that we can expand our coverage beyond just a 15-second clip. So that was the issues we've had with PIOs, where they need to separate print and TV perhaps, and give us different access to different parts of this narrative.
Can I add something to that? Because I think in terms of getting some insight into like a journalist mentality, for the non-journalists out there, like one really important thing to understand is that like being part of a press pool and being part of a herd is like death to a journalist. And so the way to, maybe
Thank you.
to get them interested in something is to offer them an exclusive and bring them somewhere no one else is going, and something no one's seen before, and only they are going to get the scene. That is like catnip to journalists, and that is definitely a way to catch their attention. Bringing them out on a tour bus with 10 other journalists is like almost unbearable.
You're so right.
Yeah. So a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'm going to share with you. On this one, speaking as a PIO, one of the main shifts in our focus on incidents is managing the world of social media. As journalists, how has social media impacted your work in covering incidents, and how can we better feed the social media needs while meeting yours?
I mean, I know that it's pushed me to get images out faster, and I think the first step in reporting or covering a wildfire is through our social media platforms. And I think that has taken over, and then everything will be printed out in detail. But social media is our best way to get our readers to understand exactly what's happening before, it goes out in print or 6 o'clock news. But also, we have to be careful because trying to be first can sometimes lead to misinformation and lacking some context, so it's a delicate balance that exists with social media today.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, the social media landscape has changed a lot recently, especially with Twitter, right? Like a lot of organizations just aren't using Twitter anymore, including mine. I don't really use Twitter either. But like when I was a breaking news editor not too long ago, it was still useful for me to go to Twitter or Facebook and find specific information about roads that were closed or what is the acreage now, et cetera. So for like breaking news situations, I think social media is a good place to just immediately keep everybody updated on all these little details that are moving really fast. But I would also be a little cautious because, like we mentioned earlier, sometimes treating all fires like disasters could be problematic, and social media doesn't really allow for that sort of nuance. So I think use social media depending on whatever the situation is, and just keeping in mind some of the issues that could come out of that.
I'm kind of a dinosaur in terms of social media, so it's not a very essential tool for me in my reporting work. But I think what I have noticed in the last few years is how powerful social media is becoming in terms of prescribed fire ecology, and like public education. And so I've noticed that it seems to be incredibly useful for folks who want to kind of expand the public understanding of fire ecology and the role of, quote unquote, good fire. And I think that I don't really see a downside necessarily to just flooding the sort of social media environment with images of intentional fire, because it is something that, so many organizations are doing, the Forest Service, these different agencies. And I think it's just really important that the public see that, to understand the full spectrum of work that is taking place. And yeah, so that's one thing that I've noticed, and I think has been very positive, actually.
Thank you. So another question. We recently took a trauma-informed communications training to build our skills as communicators to engage respectfully and with care. Can you share more about the EMS system issues that you encountered? Any advice for us to ensure we don't add to the disparities in fire response with our stories?
Yeah, so with the story I did on the car fire and a lot of the disparities that people faced, it's really difficult to address systemic issues, right? With, for instance, people who are more tied to the community of movers and shakers, the city councilors, the emergency responders, they're going to be more informed than people who are new to the area or who don't speak English. And so they're going to get less information. And that's just the nature of how our systems are built. I don't know. I think it's good to educate yourself on how that works and some of the issues that are there. It's really complex, but learning about that and how these different communities work, where are like, do you have a lot of Spanish speaking folks in your area? How are they communicating? How many speak English? How many are primarily Spanish speakers, et cetera? And how and if you do have a large population, like how do you get communication out to them effectively? It may not be Facebook or Twitter. Maybe it's like an Amber Alert type situation. I don't have any easy answers for how to address disparities, except that just being as informed as you can is probably the way to go.
One follow-up, April, regarding the legislation in Oregon. I was curious how media is being defined in these legislative pushes for access. Anyone with a WordPress blog or Twitter handle?
Yeah, that was a really big point of discussion when we first got this bill going. And of course, a lot of agencies wanted to provide a definition for media, because once you get that definition, I mean, from my perspective, when I was with the Society of Professional Journalists Oregon chapter, we did not want to have a legislative definition of media, because that would be used against us to block us out of other events. The media landscape is changing. We get new online publications all the time. Would you call a new online publication with a newsroom of 3 people a blog? I don't know. And I find it problematic that people immediately kind of gravitate towards trying to block other people out of information gathering sources, as if they're not in some way able to do it effectively. Yeah, so no, we didn't define media. We just require that people take a training, and they get the training and get certified, then they're able to access those areas.
Great, thank you. So this is kind of going back to an earlier thread, but one of the questions that we received before the webinar today was, what kind of same-day story pitches can help the prescribed good fire narrative for local media?
I think so. Same day pitches. So is that what you said?
Yeah, that's the way the question was framed. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think I maybe touched on it a little bit, but certainly I think not just prescribed burns happening from like a state or federal agency, but like also community burn associations, landowners, native tribal land, I think those are all really fantastic angles to pitch to journalists. So, and I think it also kind of helps to expand the public understanding of who is doing this type of work today. And it's actually more diverse than I think most of us appreciate. The fire is not just being practiced or controlled at the state or federal level. There are really interesting, diverse communities and individuals across the country who are trying to either resurrect, these practices, or have continuously been practicing them, or, who are really just building community from the ground up around this issue. And I think that's quite powerful and very attractive to journalists to cover. So anything with those kinds of angles, I think, is fantastic.
Yeah, different angles that don't just require us photographing or filming fire crews working, getting more in touch with the community and how are they for it or against it. Seeing that perspective would really, I'd jump on that right away, because we have enough firefighter images and all that. But getting the word from a rancher, and what maybe they have experienced through the generations prior. That perspective is almost never looked into when it comes to prescribed burns. So a variety of approaches would definitely be welcoming.
So one of the things we looked at before the event, before this webinar, was a question that I think connects to this, and it's, underserved and historically marginalized communities and organizations that represent them often have specific concerns when it comes to engaging with media. And can you share ways that you've worked with these communities, particularly indigenous communities, and tried to address those concerns? Any suggestions or lessons learned from failures?
Well, I know that in my case, being bilingual, it has helped in covering more Latino or Hispanic communities, when it comes to wildfires, because like we mentioned earlier, there's a lack of information out there that can be translated into different languages right away. And there's also the issue of immigration and immigration status. A lot of folks who need help are afraid to ask for it. So in my experience, I've kind of had to become a translator and kind of bridge that gap that it exists in a lot of these communities. But anything to help out and tell stories as well.
I can speak to some, experiences I've had in terms of reporting on fire issues, specifically with Indigenous communities. And I think the conclusion that I come to and just keep coming back to is transparency is everything, because that's what creates trust. And so being extremely upfront about the process, what's entailed in the reporting, but also like your point of view as a journalist. So it's not that you have to tell somebody, exactly what it is that you're going to report, but just sort of being really upfront with what your motives are for even doing the story and communicating that, whether or not you think they're going to like what they hear. And so, yeah, just announcing oneself, being transparent about who you are and the process, I think is really critical. And then also I would say that there are, some rules in journalism that are pretty widely practiced. And one of them is, not necessarily sending a source an entire story before publication. And I have to say that there are increasingly instances where I'm willing to be flexible about that, depending on who the source is, because I think that there are certain stories that are not necessarily ours to tell, and there is a great degree of generosity and trust involved in giving someone a story to tell. And oftentimes now I will make exceptions where I will want someone to know before publication what is going to come out, so that they're comfortable with that and that trust feels warranted. I don't do it with every source, and it's sort of on a case-by-case basis, but I think the most important thing is to be a human before you're a journalist, and to practice ethical journalism, but also to make sure that you're not, so rigid that you're not treating that person like a human, and having that trust and transparency throughout.
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's a maybe an evolution in journalism. As you alluded to, it's sort of not the traditional way that a lot of journalism is approached, but maybe it is something that we have in the future or now. So let's see. This is another question from the audience. How can prescribed fire community members get the media to stop referring to land as being destroyed by fire?
Yeah, obviously, I think we kind of covered this a bit, but just always having more public information out there about what this is and what it means and providing context. When there is a large fire, like here in Oregon, it's almost always out in the forest. And the information we get is acres burned, whatever, personnel on the thing, buildings destroyed. And that's the only information we get. We don't really get a lot of context from agencies or really anything else. So for new reporters who aren't aware and they're on the like breaking news beat, they're just seeing that little placard and they're just putting it out there. They don't know, they don't have the context. So I think if we could provide, maybe just have a document explaining what this all is and including that with the acres burned, et cetera, et cetera. What does this mean? That would be helpful, especially for new reporters who are new to the topic.
Yeah, man, this is such a important issue, I think, and kind of a pet peeve of mine. And I almost wish that in the incident command, in the management teams, when they're issuing these daily, releases of information, that they had a caveat, which is that we know acres burned, but we won't know burn severity or these other effects until a further date. But it's very difficult from a daily news reporting standpoint, to leave room for that kind of nuance, right? And that extra level of depth in terms of the news reporting. And really, what would be fantastic is if you could somehow know 2 months from now when those burn severity maps are released, what the consequences were. And hopefully their journalists are following up 2 months later, but are they really? And how many people are really reading the stories then after the disaster has sort of concluded? So I actually think this is a issue that really needs some serious attention, and I don't know what the answer is of how to bridge this gap between not knowing the fire effects in the moment and the constraints of daily news reporting and how to make those things. But I think one thing would just be journalists becoming more aware of how fixed and historically consistent the vocabulary around wildfire has been. If you go back to the fires of 1910, everything was raging, everything was devastated, and we're still talking about wildfire in the same limited vocabulary. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So
There's another question that I think kind of highlights this a little bit and takes it in a different direction, but talking about good fire in the context of a bad wildfire seems insensitive. When is best post-wildfire to address good fire?
Yeah, I mean, I like including, post fire, right? Because it's really difficult to talk about a fire being good when it's destroying people's homes and livelihoods. But for me, with the Alameda fire, the immediate aftermath was really hard, and I did do more coverage on people's lives being upended. But about I don't know, I think it might have been a year later, I went on a bike ride with a forest ecologist through a greenway where the fire had burned. And he showed me all of the benefits that came of that fire. He started explaining the logs provide such and such thing for the fish, and that's good for them. And we've got these new wildflowers coming up, et cetera. And that story, I think, was an example of how fire is good for the landscape. And it was a year later, so it was kind of past the point of the immediate after effects. We were still doing reporting on people's lives being upended, because even today, 4 years later, people are still living in hotels and don't have housing because of the fire. But I think balancing both is definitely doable, and I don't think you have to do one or the other.
I was gonna also add that it might not necessarily be sensitive to be taught or even using the term good fire in the midst of a wildfire incident. But I think there are like a couple of things that could be added to the coverage that just help give a bit of context and historical kind of perspective. So one of them would be for journalists when reporting on a wildfire that's happening to say, like, what type of landscape is this fire burning in? Is it a fire adapted landscape? What is the historical return interval for, fire? When is the last time that a fire burned here? Because if it hasn't burned for 100 years, that's quite interesting and maybe explains why we're seeing what we're seeing on the ground and or the scale of the fire, et cetera. So there's, I think, this those types of questions that often aren't asked, but if those could easily be inserted into daily news coverage of a wildfire incident, and I think would help people to understand why fires are burning the way that they are, making room for the fact that fire is not always a disaster. Oftentimes we don't know until, after the fact. And also just, I think, simultaneously respecting the fact that people's lives are impacted and often that is devastating. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the crucial questions that journalists could be bringing to their reporting.
Maura, I'm curious, I know in particular you've worked with, both as a journalist and also as a practitioner in various regions, in North America. And I'm curious, do you think that wildfire and the discussion of wildland fire is perceived really, really differently across those regions? And are there things that maybe can be brought from, say, the Southeast or the plains that would be useful to folks in the West who are dealing with at least more highly publicized and more large-scale extreme wildfires?
Yeah, I think we chatted a little bit about this before the webinar, but like I've had the conversation with several different people about the way that California has almost dominated the media coverage of the wildfire crisis in the United States, and how actually that crisis doesn't look the same everywhere and isn't manifesting the same everywhere. And California just seems to kind of suck up all the oxygen in the media, partly because it's so dramatic. Also, I think that certain, groups of people in California have been very good at either giving access or sort of influencing media coverage. So for better or for worse, like that's often what people think fire looks like. And that's the kind of extent of their awareness of fire, which is quite unfortunate. And I think I do think the Southeast provides a really fascinating and excellent example of a completely different way that fire just exists in the public sphere, in a much more accepted and everyday fashion. And there's a lot to learn from that. I think, for instance, in North Carolina, I was part of a crew that burned in the middle of the day, next to a middle school and a high school during the school day, and parents were doing pickups and drop-offs, and there's smoke in the air and nobody said anything and the media didn't care. And that's really interesting to me. It's not even necessarily an event, but it's because there's this background understanding of, well, that's work that needs to take place. And so just the level of acceptance is so much higher. I don't think it's a coincidence that like the Southeast is also a place where you see fire being celebrated much more explicitly, and sort of even young kids being exposed to fire through these fire festivals where it's just fire is fun and it is good. So, and then, yeah, that is, I think, something that then, journalists show up and they get a picture of, the woodpecker, stuffed animal with the kid and a drip torch and all this stuff. And it's just a really much more, I just don't see that happening anywhere else. So I think it is a really interesting example, and there's a lot more work to do in terms of journalists just, yeah, understanding that things are more varied and diverse than just what's happening in Northern California in August, you know.
So we are at a little bit after 2:20, so kind of getting close to the end of our time. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you again, and I guess I'm curious, you know, for each of you, and maybe Roberto was starting with you, like kind of what aren't we talking about today, maybe that we should be, or what would you like to make sure that the folks on this webinar hear that you think will be, you know, valuable to them and to journalists and to all of us who are in this space?
Definitely, and I know we've talked at length about this, but having the opportunity to cover wildfires on the same level that we can do so in Arizona, California, and so far, but just having the resources available in a state like New Mexico, where we can be a vehicle for better understanding as to what is happening, whether it's a prescribed burn, a good fire, bad fire, however you want to call it. I think that if we can get that support on, you know, legislative level where we can get access, that would definitely be a step in the right direction. And I think for many, many years we've begged to no avail. If we can do that, we can better explain the complicated process of wildland fires in a very complicated geographic area like New Mexico. Everybody assumes that, you know, we can cover fires here in New Mexico like we can in California and in Arizona, but that's the perspective everyone gets. They get the California perspective. And I think this is a complex issue that needs to be weighed and balanced on a whole different scale. We need that access. And in a place like New Mexico, where people don't have all the resources, it would benefit many different communities. We have a large immigrant community, our tribal community. Though our communities on the Navajo Nation, Apache Reservation, where some don't speak English, and having information available to some of these folks, you know, in their own language would be very, very helpful. So we need some sort of effort to try to bridge that gap. That's really an issue that maybe you don't see in a lot of places like California, but definitely it's something to think about here in New Mexico or parts of the Southwest.
Thank you, Roberto. April, if you want to take a shot at the kind of last thoughts here.
Yeah, no, I think this was a really good conversation, and I'm glad we got to talk about some of the major issues with access and just public messaging around the nuance with fire. I know that it's a really frustrating landscape to be working in, what with high turnover with journalists and the increase of climate change. I just think, you know, the more we stick with it and the more that we continue putting out public information out there and learning materials for people and just building relationships with people that we work with regularly, the easier it'll be.
Maura?
Yeah, I think maybe the thing I would want to leave folks with is that journalists don't know much about anything, and we are completely reliant on our sources. And so for people listening in the audience, like, I would just hope that you understand, like, you know things and you see things and you are an expert in ways that journalists can never really be, and that we need your eyes and your ears on the ground, and we want to be speaking with you, and we want those stories. It's not that we can always promise every story, or that we're not under our own restrictions of time and resources or editorial control, but like the inclination for all journalists is to get the story, and you guys have the best stories because you see and do this work every day. And so, yeah, just to be starting those conversations with us, and to always realize that I think journalists want to hear from folks like you more than maybe you think they do. And so please just, remember that, and give us three all of your best tips. So.
Thank you. And yeah, I really awesome conversation from my perspective, and I enjoyed hearing from each of you, and it's I wish we had more time, and I'm sure you'll all be getting lots of story pitches now, so so look out. But thank you again, and thanks to everyone who joined. It was a great turnout, and for a really important topic. And Laurel, I don't think you're gonna pop on and maybe close us out.
Yeah,
think-
thank you again, everyone, for coming, particularly our panelists. That was wonderful. Just a quick reminder, we have 2 more of these webinars coming up. The next one will be with fire and communication professionals to sort of talk about the fire side of the house of this conversation of, before you talk to the journalist, what do you need to know? What do you need to have straight? How do you articulate your message in a way that is useful and accurate? And then in June, we'll be talking specifically about crisis communication and how to think about these things and messaging when you're in the middle of a situation that is changing quickly, that has a lot of moving parts, and that may also have some serious sort of emotional components that you have to consider also. So we hope you'll join us for those. You can go on our website or on those bit.ly links to register, just like you did for today. And that's all we've got. Thank you again, mostly, especially to our panelists, to everyone who joined, and hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, y'all.